Controlling the center immediately offers space and sets up future attacking possibilities. Solidifying the center and immediately challenging white's pawn. 1. d5 creates symmetrical pawn structures and opens lines for rapid development. Challenging the center's integrity, white immediately aims to shatter black's central pawn structure and seize the initiative. Solidifying the pawn center, this move builds a robust defensive structure, a hallmark of the Slav-Defense. Securing the central pawn advance while preparing to castle and control key squares. Developing the knight to its natural outpost solidifies black's central pawn structure, preparing for further queenside expansion and challenging white's early initiative. Solidifying the center and preparing for queenside development, this move champions a positional struggle over immediate aggression. Developing the bishop outside the pawn chain creates immediate diagonal pressure, a proactive stance against white's central ambitions. Developing a knight to an active square here solidifies central control and prepares further piece play, setting the stage for a rich positional struggle. Solidifying the pawn chain, this move prepares to develop the queen's bishop and contest the center, a cornerstone of queen's gambit decline structures. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside castling, this bishop maneuver develops a piece while maintaining flexibility in the pawn structure. This move is 6. b2, a common response in the semi-Slav defense. White aims for a safe and sound development, ready to castle and support the d4 pawn. Black's bf5 is an active piece, and white's b2 aims to challenge it or at least neutralize its pressure. Slinging that pawn forward abandons the central grip, potentially creating an isolated pawn later if white recaptures with the bishop and doesn't manage the pawn structure carefully. It's a bold decision that concedes a bit of immediate central influence for what appears to be a freeing of the c8 bishop. Recapturing the pawn with the bishop untangles white's queenside pieces and reinforces control over the central dark squares, preparing for potential kingside expansion while keeping the pawn structure solid. Reclaiming the pawn is important, but repositioning the bishop to a more active square like d6, where it influences the queenside and prepares for potential b5 expansion, demonstrates strategic foresight. The queen now supports the bishop on c4, preparing to castle kingside and connect the rooks, while also surveying the central squares and potentially discouraging any immediate pawn pushes from black that would disrupt white's central pawn structure. Dislodging that well-placed bishop from its aggressive square offers immediate tactical possibilities, potentially opening lines towards the white king and disrupting the opponent's development rhythm. Challenging the bishop's placement now forces a decision, potentially disrupting black's developing harmony and creating a new outpost for white's knight if it retreats to a less active square. Striking the knight immediately after white's pawn push forces a recapture, opening the h-file and potentially creating long-term attacking prospects for black. This exchange also relinquishes white's central pawn majority advantage, offering black freer piece development and a chance to equalize. Liberating the queen, white initiates a direct confrontation for central influence while simultaneously untangling piece play and creating pathways for future queenside development. The immediate result is a queen trade that simplifies the position and focuses attention on the subtle pawn structure interplay. Seeking a safer haven for its bishop, this retreat aims to consolidate its position, anticipating potential knight invasions into the d4 outpost while preserving an active dark-squared bishop for future central control. Prioritizing development and piece activity, white signals an intent to castle kingside soon, aiming to connect the rooks and activate the queen's bishop. This pawn thrust aims to gain queenside space and potentially dislodge the bishop on d2, though it also creates a potential weakness on the b5 square if white can exploit it later. Opening the central column for the rook, white establishes a vital presence on the d-file, directly challenging black's pawn structure and aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses that might arise. Unlocking the queenside, this maneuver aims to activate the queen and prepare for a potential b5 pawn thrust, challenging white's seemingly passive bishop development and seeking to seize more central space. Reclaiming the bishop to the c1 square might seem like a passive retreat, but it fundamentally reshapes the board's tension by preparing to contest the central files and potentially launch an attack along the e-file. Nurturing the knight's journey toward the kingside is crucial for black's queenside development to catch up. This repositioning prepares for a potential nb6, aiming to contest the c4 bishop's influence and bolster the central pawn chain. Unleashing a central pawn advance, white seeks to seize more space and potentially create attacking opportunities, but must be mindful of the unleashed tension and the potential for counterplay along the now open central files. A daring bid to seize initiative, this advance on the queenside aims to dislodge white's centralized pawn and potentially create an outpost on the b4 square, though it does invite counterplay and might overextend black's queenside presence if not adequately supported. Reclaiming control of the bishop diagonal allows white to connect rooks and potentially target the black queenside soon. Embracing the center, black boldly pushes the e-pawn, challenging white's central control and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure for potential tactical opportunities. This advance immediately creates a dynamic imbalance, forcing white to consider responses that could lead to sharper play or an even more locked position, depending on white's chosen reaction to this pivotal pawn thrust. Asserting control over the queenside territory, the pawn advance disrupts black's queenly ambitions and prepares to contest the b4 square. Shifting the queen to the edge of the board after the recent skirmishes seems to be about repositioning for future action, perhaps eyeing that potentially vulnerable d4 pawn or preparing to connect the rooks more effectively once the central pawn structure stabilizes. This maneuver allows black to explore possibilities on the queenside, while white's pieces are somewhat congested. Opening the d-file here is a bold assertion, immediately challenging the central pawn structure and aiming to disrupt black's bishop development by forcing it to a less active square. This aggressive stride injects immediate tension, potentially leading to an open game where piece activity and precise calculation will be paramount. It's a declaration that white is not content with passive development and seeks to exploit any positional weakness that arises from black's rather passive piece placement on the queenside. Initiating a central pawn thrust here opens up the game considerably, aiming to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened dark squares around the black king. This injection of central dynamics forces black to immediately reevaluate their piece placement and defensive posture, as the previously comfortable pawn chain is now fractured. Pouncing on the opportunity, white expertly snatches the pawn, immediately creating a powerful central pawn majority and a potential outpost on d5, cramping black's development and restricting the bishop on c8's activity. This knight maneuver, striking at the heart of white's pawn structure and challenging the central dominance, is a dynamic response to the prior pawn sacrifice. Black aims to disrupt white's coordination, opening lines for counterplay and seeking to exploit any lingering weaknesses around the white king. The potential for a doubled pawn on d5 creates an interesting positional tension that might be a future target. Centralizing the rook on the open file after the pawn exchange immediately challenges black's queen, forcing a decision about its safety while preparing to occupy the critical d-file for long-term influence. The king, now tucked behind a pawn shield, finds a safer haven amidst the evolving central chaos, preparing to connect its rooks and activate them on the open files that are starting to materialize. Castling king's side immediately solidifies the monarch and prepares the rooks for central involvement. Seeking to activate the rook and gain central presence, this maneuver aims to contest the open d-file, potentially preparing for future skirmishes involving the queen and other pieces on this crucial avenue. Strategically reinforcing the center with this bishop maneuver offers both defensive solidity and future attacking potential, aiming to control key squares and potentially launch a kingside assault. Boldly challenging the center, f5 injects dynamism into the position by aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially liberate black's pieces, although it opens avenues for counterplay along the f-file for white. The bishop repositions, eyeing the critical dark squares and preparing to defend the king should the e-file become compromised. Seeking refuge from the central storm brewing, the Black King tucks away, a prudent step to shore up his defenses before the inevitable clashes on the e-file and potentially the queenside begin. Exploiting the open diagonal to target the d6 bishop is a clever gambit, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and create attacking chances. The central pawn advance now creates a fascinating tension, opening lines for your pieces while potentially exposing your king if not handled carefully. Aim to leverage the newfound diagonal for your queen and consider reinforcing the e4 outpost. Recentralizing the queen after the skirmish on the e-file creates a more robust defense for the king and prepares to potentially challenge Black's advanced pawn on e4. Unleashing a knight to e5 injects immediate dynamism into the queenside, challenging White's central pawn structure and creating opportunities for counterplay. Unveiling the knight's new outpost, White aims to solidify control over key dark squares and discourage Black's aggressive intentions, particularly on the e-file. Unleashing a bold queen sortie, Black immediately challenges White's centralized bishop, seeking to exploit the potential weaknesses created by White's recent pawn advance and knight repositioning. Striking at the undefended bishop, White seizes the initiative and forces a concession, disrupting Black's coordinated pieces and creating a clear imbalance that will require careful navigation. A brilliant tactical strike. This knight's sortie uncovers a devastating attack, forcing White's king into immediate peril and creating a beautiful mating net. Securing the monarch from the knight's surprising assault is paramount, as the immediate check would have forced a devastating material loss or exposed the king further. Sacrificing the knight opens a critical diagonal for the queen, creating immediate threats to White's king and potentially liberating Black's rook from its defensive duties. Reclaiming the bishop opens a crucial diagonal, forcing a reevaluation of the king's safety, which, despite being castled, now finds its protective pawn shield weakened and exposed to potential central incursions. The queen's reroute to f4 is a bold attempt to activate her on the kingside, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around White's monarch. Black hopes to generate counterplay by targeting the f2 pawn and potentially creating a battery with a future bishop move. However, this sortie might also expose the queen to tactical challenges, and White's pieces are well positioned to monitor her movements and exploit the temporary disarray in Black's camp. The position is quite tense. The interplay of queen and rook against White's advanced pawns and piece activity will be crucial. Shifting the king to a safer square addresses the immediate threat and prepares for potential defensive maneuvers, but it also subtly signals a willingness to weather a storm rather than actively seeking counterplay, a decision that could prove telling in the coming exchanges. Reclaiming the pawn opens up attacking avenues along the weakened kingside, aiming to exploit the exposed White monarch and the recently freed queen. The king's newfound liberty on g2, while seemingly safe, exposes a critical diagonal that Black's bishop could potentially exploit later, creating a subtle positional vulnerability if White doesn't actively defend it. Seizing the initiative after a sequence of exchanges, the capture of the d-pawn creates an immediate imbalance, potentially opening lines for your rooks and forcing White to address the new pawn structure that has emerged on the kingside where his monarch currently resides. The rook shifts to the open file, a powerful assertion of dominance, aiming to exploit the newly created diagonal pressure against Black's beleaguered king. Shifting the queen to an active central square seeks to exploit the slightly loose nature of White's d5 pawn and potentially disrupt the alignment of White's pieces. The rook slides to the 5th rank, activating this piece to a more influential diagonal, potentially creating threats along the c-file or even targeting weaknesses on the kingside if opportunities arise. The knight's sudden appearance on the 4th rank creates immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the exposed king and potentially dismantle White's pawn structure with a subsequent capture on g3. The king's journey to the flank seeks refuge amidst the advancing pawns and attacking knights, a desperate bid for safety as the center collapses under pressure. Re-establishing the queen's influence on the central files, this move intends to disrupt White's rook placement and probe for weaknesses. The strategic aim here is to leverage the open queen's pawn position and the potential for tactical skirmishes on the e-file, forcing white to constantly reassess their defensive posture. It's about maintaining dynamic tension and creating opportunities for counterplay by increasing the pressure on white's pieces. A key consideration is the potential to exploit any hesitation or miscalculation from white regarding the coordination of their rooks and bishop. By keeping the queen actively engaged, black seeks to seize the initiative and dictate the flow of the game, rather than passively reacting to white's threats. The move also prepares for potential pawn advances or knight maneuvers that could exploit white's slightly cramped kingside. Unleashing a decisive mating attack by forcing the black king into a perilous open space, this sacrifice clears a direct path for the white queen and rook to exploit the compromised kingside. Surrendering the pawn on g7, black solidifies the knight's outpost on e5 and prepares to regroup, though this does open lines towards the monarch. Suddenly, the board opens up, and a forced sequence begins with a decisive sacrifice that aims to simplify into a winning endgame. Unleashing a daring counterattack, black gambles on the king's weakened defenses, aiming to exploit the exposed white monarch for a swift resolution. The king's sanctuary is shattered, exposing the monarch to open warfare on the 7th rank.